Hi, welcome to this short recap on data analysis, and in particular we're going to be looking at thematic analysis as an approach to analyse your data. What I'm hoping to do here is identify the 5 or sometimes 6 phases of thematic analysis as according to Braun and Clark 2006, to emphasise the importance of being familiar with your data in the first place, then to evaluate when thematic analysis might be the appropriate approach, which is for our purposes in most cases, and then to practice thematic analysis with a familiar example, just to get you into the swing of things. Okay, let's dispatch with the criticisms first, because no theory or method is absolutely 100% watertight. So here are my criticisms represented by the bullet holes. The thematic analysis is a very wide-ranging, broad approach. It's an approach rather than a kind of a branded approach like grounded theory may be. Therefore, between practitioners, researchers who use thematic analysis and critique it, there's no agreement over what the rules are. Some consider it to be no more than a light form of grounded theory, so say Braun and Clark. However, Braun and Clark are key proponents of using thematic analysis, despite that so-called criticism. And the final one is that it can be accused of bias, as the researcher decides on the points of interest, the codes, the themes, and so on. And you'll see these play out in my example towards the back end of this video, where I've chosen the themes, and I'm perhaps biased in some ways. Well, I am biased in lots of ways. However, all research can be accused of bias, because all research at some point involves a subjective interpretation of human beings. Even so-called highly positivistic methodologies still involve a level of interpretation, and with interpretation comes bias, and that's supported by Hennick et al. 2011. So just because a research methodology has limitations of bias, we shouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater. So, having looked at what some of the problems may be, and I would say those problems, criticisms could be levelled at most kinds of research, let's have a look at what thematic analysis actually is. It's an inductive approach. I'll come on to what that might mean towards the back end of the video. It's very flexible, and that's why I'm choosing to present this to you at this stage in your research process, that it can be applied to more or less everything that you guys are researching. It can be incorporated into any epistemological approach, i.e. that how we understand the world to be, we can use thematic analysis to interpret and represent that worldview. It's a deliberate decision, it involves a deliberate decision to wait until all the data is collected, and to allow for structures of signification to emerge, so says Geertz. This is therefore an inductive or a bottom-up approach. We need all the data in place before we start imposing a particular interpretation on it. It goes beyond merely describing implicit ideas, i.e. it tries to find the relationship between different sets of ideas, and the relationships are not always obvious. And finally, in adapting the thematic analysis approach, we need to demonstrate a sense of rigour. And you'll see what I mean by this with my boxes analogy. Hence, the 5 or sometimes 6 phases, discrete, distinct, structured phases are proposed by Braun and Clark. I do recommend that you access the Braun and Clark literature, which is presented to you at the back end of this video. I will present a link to it as well, but you can get hold of it yourself, because it's almost like a training manual, if you like, is the Braun and Clark article, which will set out for you the way that you should undertake the method of analysis. So here we are with my boxes analogy that I alluded to earlier. Braun and Clark say that thematic analysis should take place in 6 discrete stages. So here's all our data in the warehouse, boxes on the floor, boxes on the shelves. We can't really make a lot of sense of it, it's all random. But Braun and Clark say we can make sense of it by treating it in 6 discrete phases. And here we're putting the boxes onto the conveyor belt to deal with each box or phase in turn. Phase one is familiarization with the data. You need to flick through the data, read the data, get a sense of what's available in your data. Is that, transcripts of interviews, or is it, leafing through all your questionnaires and seeing the kind of responses that people have put into the questionnaire? Then I'm going to give you an example of how we might generate initial codes from those data. Then we chunk those codes into themes, more general principles of what links those codes together. We then, in phase four, review the themes and see if, did we generate some red herrings? Did we kind of go down a rabbit hole? We thought we might have some themes, but actually there's only one or two instances of that theme. So really, it's not really a theme, it's an outlier. We might want to include it, but there might be some more glaringly obvious themes that are emerging from the data. I'll give you an example of what this might look like with a familiar example towards the end of the video. So don't worry about this too much at the minute. Then phase five, we define and name the themes, give them something that's tangible, it makes sense to us, it gives us something that we can work with like a tool. I'll give you an example as well of what that might look like in a bit. And then finally, we pull all that stuff together and represent it in a narrative that will make sense to our readers when we're writing the report. So, as a brief conclusion, and returning to the idea of induction, what thematic analysis is keen to stress is that we don't go into the process of analysis with a very fixed set of preconceived ideas, i.e. we don't try to impose too much theory onto the data. We could say an overly theoretical approach is a deductive or top-down approach. Instead, we take an inductive approach. So let's imagine that theory is theory is the duck on the top of the water, and when the duck comes up, inducts, you see what I'm doing there, ducks, induction, deduction, I'm playing with words, that when the duck comes up from below the surface, i.e. those are the themes emerging from the data, like the duck's head is emerging from the water, so it's an inductive bottom-up process. It's also iterative to some extent, that we need to keep, when we're identifying the themes and translating our data into meaningful themes, we do need to look at the literature and contextualise those themes. So this is why you might be going back into the lit review that you've done and thinking, are these themes, are these echoing the kind of things that surfaced out of my lit review? Did other studies find similar sorts of themes in their analysis? Having said this, also be prepared to be surprised by the data. You might have gone into the research process asking a certain set of questions and things like that, and people tend to respond in a way that makes sense to them. Don't discount if you've asked a certain type of question and the person has come back with a kind of random answer. It might not be actually random at all, but it might make sense to them in the context and their lived experience of what they're trying to express when they're stimulated by the question, either on a questionnaire or an interview or something like this. So don't be afraid to also identify things that you weren't necessarily looking for but are kind of emerging out of the data. So this final point, similar to my duck metaphor, don't put the theoretical cart before the empirical horse. In other words, don't try to impose too much theory into your analysis. Just read the data in an open mind and try and make sense of what's emerging out of the data without trying to contextualize it with too much theory. Be the duck emerging from the water. Okay. Here are some key texts that I referenced in preparing this video. The key text that I do recommend that you go to, because it operates a little bit like a manual, is the Braun and Clark source from 2006 using thematic analysis in psychology, because it will serve like a manual to you and put more meat on the bones of the video presentation that I've just prepared. Okay, so let's have a go. I'll put a link to this, but in case you're looking at this video from elsewhere, it's easy to search YouTube for The Simpsons, The Perfect Balance. It's about a 6-minute clip, and I'd like you to watch The Simpsons clip. But don't watch The Simpsons as you probably did in the past, you know, with a cup of coffee on an evening at 6 o'clock after a hard day at work. I want you to actually watch the clip with a purpose. What I want you to watch the clip with a purpose is to have an awareness of how you can spot themes, recurring themes and patterns that emerge in The Simpsons. In The Simpsons, a similar sort of thing happened in every sort of episode. The commentator of the piece says that there are three key themes that surface in almost every episode of The Simpsons, and if the author was right, or the commentator rather was right, in a thesis or a dissertation on The Simpsons, they would have three key research questions that they'd be wanting to look at. So according to the commentator, he said that within The Simpsons you had these three themes of it being cartoon-like, which is like Looney Tunes, Tom and Jerry, Wile E. Coyote and Roadrunner, those kind of things, ridiculous gags that could never happen in real life. At the same time, you had things that were very much like real life, real representations of family life, things that everybody could, or at least European, Western European, Northern American, whatever, people could identify with as being similar to happening in their family. And then also you had key sort of moral messages, take-homes that the audience was supposed to think, that would be a key message or lesson for an individual to live a better life. And what the author or the commentator was saying here is that why The Simpsons was so successful as a show is that it managed to balance those three things of being cartoonish, being like real life, and having lessons. So I've had a go here, and I've come up with my own codes. I've seen where Homer, in every episode, Homer acts like an idiot in some way. So if I was watching The Simpsons, I would code instances as where Homer acts like an idiot as H at I. So rather having to write out the full laborious sentence as Homer acting like an idiot, I would write out H at I. You could say that even that's a laborious code, and is it really necessary for the I? So you can adapt your codes if you like Braun and Clark recommend. And actually, if I went back to this again, I wouldn't have H at I. I would just say that when Homer's acting like an idiot, I would code it as HI. On the other hand, sometimes Homer acts as a caring father and husband. And when I saw instances of that in The Simpsons, I would code that as HC. Can you see instances of HC in the clip, the 6-minute clip related to this video? According to the author, the commentator, he says that one of the key things that distinguished The Simpsons from other TV shows like South Park or Family Guy was each episode had this key message, a lesson, if you like. So in watching various episodes of The Simpsons, you could find out what kind of a message that message was. Was it a message about social responsibility? Or was it a critique of shallow capitalism? Or was it a sense of growth or epiphany, a light bulb moment? Did the characters get a light bulb moment on how they could live a better life? And if I was watching these shows, when I saw instances of that, if I saw the lesson and it was about social responsibility, I would code it as SR. If it was about shallow capitalism, SC. And if it was an instance about growth and epiphany, I would code it GE. You can do a similar thing by watching The Simpsons. Can you see elements of messages, key lessons, which are about being more socially responsible? Critique of shallow capitalism, for example, the more religious episode that we can see in the clip. And are there elements where the characters become better people of learning some sort of life lesson? And if that's the case, you would code it GE. So, I would argue that the commentator, if they were writing this as a dissertation type thesis, in their lit review, they'd likely have split their lit review into 3 or maybe 4 sections. They would explore how the media or TV shows have tried to imitate representations of real family life. Just ignore the coloured codes for a sec. They'd also write another section about the history of how cartoon gags work, perhaps rooted back into the 1920s and slapstick silent movies and things like that, but really came into their own in the sort of 40s, 50s and 60s with the development of cartoons like Tom and Jerry and Wile E. Coyote. Really impossible situations taking place for the sense of humour, for a sense of humour. Then also, how did morality or deeper messages then become embedded into media like films and cartoons? And how did The Simpsons accomplish this? And then what the author is particularly interested in is this thesis question of why did The Simpsons decline? From being one of the most popular shows on TV for 10 or 20 years, why did people stop watching The Simpsons? And what the author is claiming throughout the 6 minute video, or if it was actually a written thesis, a dissertation, they're saying that this balance of three things got out of whack. The representations of family life, cartoonish gags, and deeper meaningful messages became skewed and less balanced, and there became more of an emphasis on cartoonish gags like Wile E. Coyote and things like that. And that tended to push The Simpsons into a less original TV show and mimic what was happening in other probably well executed, more fresh, more edgy cartoons like The Family Guy and South Park and things like that. And therefore, if you were going through episodes of The Simpsons, the latter episodes of The Simpsons, you would be looking for evidence of where those three elements became out of balance. And when that was happening, I would code it with creative decline. Now, because each of those phrases are quite wordy, I've summarised them. Again, it's up to my bias here, my interpretation. I've recoded representations of real family life as RFL, cartoonish gags as CG, deeper meaning, message or lesson as ML, and creative decline simply as D. If you didn't actually want to use those acronyms, which you don't have to, you could go through your transcripts or your questionnaires and code them with different colour highlighter pens. Red for representations of family life and so on, and purple for creative decline, as long as you tell your reader how you did that coding. And it's also important that you write a little key like this that I have that say cartoonish gags are always in green, so you don't lose track when you're doing your coding. Because, you might not be doing all your coding in one session. You might come back to it a different day and you might think, what does green mean again? So it's useful to have a little key like this when you're doing the process. Okay, I hope you found that kind of useful as an overview, a refresher of how you might use thematic analysis and coding in your own research when you're analysing your data. And if you had a run through, low risk with the Simpsons cartoon and just went through trying to identify themes and codes and things like that, it might set you further on in the right direction at understanding how the process works. But as I've said many times in this video, do go to the Braun and Clark article because it does function a little bit like a manual setting out how thematic analysis and coding works. Okay guys, I hope you find that useful.